Introduction. The world that slows you down. Picture this. It is somewhere in the late hours. The kind of late where the house has its own specific silence, where every sound from outside has its own distinct character, and the background noise of the day has finally, gradually, pulled back. The light in your room is low, or maybe it is gone completely, and you are here, settling in. The particular settling in that takes a few minutes, because your body still carries the weight of everything the day required, and the thoughts have not quite gotten the message yet that they are supposed to slow down with everything else. And somewhere in your memory, somewhere not too far from reach, there is a world, a wide, breathing, amber-colored world. Mountains with snow on their peaks catching the last glow of a fading afternoon. Rivers that move through valleys with that specific sound of water over stone that no recording ever quite fully captures, but that you know the feeling of all the same. Campfires throwing warm, flickering light against faces that carry the accumulated weight of decisions they cannot take back. Horses breathing slow in the cold night air, their warm breath rising in small clouds. The distant sound of a harmonica drifting across a camp where people who chose the hard life are trying, in their small and imperfect ways, to make it mean something before the morning comes and the running starts again. That world is Red Dead Redemption 2. And tonight, we are going to live inside it slowly. Not as a game summary, not as a breakdown of missions or an argument about canon, or a tier list of which outlaws would survive if you pitted them against each other in some hypothetical bracket. What we are doing tonight is something quieter than any of that. We are going to walk through what this game actually teaches about life. What it whispers to you in the long spaces between gunshots and sunsets, in the pauses while Arthur sits alone on a hillside in the early morning, writing in his journal by the pale yellow light of a lantern, sketching deer he has watched in the trees for 10 minutes before putting his pencil to paper, trying to put into plain and honest words what he feels about the people around him and the shape his life has taken and the things he wishes had gone differently and the things, still, he wants to do before his clock runs out. Because there is a reason this game has stayed in people's hearts years after they set the controller down. There is a reason people return to it not just to play it in the conventional sense, but to exist inside it. To saddle a horse at dawn and ride out of camp with no destination at all, just to see what the light does when it comes over the plains. To sit at the gang's campfire and let the conversations wash over you. The ones that have nothing to do with the main plot and everything to do with what it means to be a person who is trying, against considerable odds, to live with some kind of decency inside a world that is not especially rewarding of that effort. Red Dead Redemption 2 was released in October 2018 after years of development by Rockstar Games. A studio that already had a reputation for detailed open worlds chose to spend 8 years building something that went beyond any previous ambition. And the investment shows in ways that go far beyond the technical, though the technical achievements are genuinely staggering. Snow in the game's northern regions deforms realistically under footsteps and horse hooves. Mud accumulates on clothing and dries at a rate influenced by actual environmental conditions. Animals in the open world have individual behaviors and territories and daily routines that they follow, whether or not the player is nearby to observe them. Rain comes with its own weight and smell and effect on every surface it touches. The ecosystem has predators and prey, and the dynamics between them play out in real time, in the background of every ride through the wilderness. It is a world built by people who cared about the difference between something that looks alive and something that actually is. But none of that technical achievement is why we are here tonight. We are here because Arthur Morgan is one of the most fully realized human beings ever created in a work of fiction. We are here because Dutch van der Linde's slow, awful descent from a dreaming visionary into a frightened man, clinging to collapsing lies, teaches something both painful and genuinely useful about how ideology curdles when it meets an uncooperative world. We are here because in the space between a sunrise in the grizzlies and a quiet death on a mountain, this game packed more honest wisdom about mortality, about loyalty, about change and loss, and the nature of character under pressure, than most books manage across several hundred pages, and most films manage in 2 hours. The game is set in 1899, the last days of a world that is vanishing. The American frontier, That vast concept that had defined the country's mythology and self-image for over a century is closing. Railroads have replaced the open trail as the primary artery of movement and commerce. Lawmen, backed by powerful industrial money, are hunting the last of the outlaw gangs, not because those gangs pose any particular threat to civilization anymore, but because their existence is an inconvenience to the story that civilization wants to tell about itself, the story of order and progress, and the inevitability of the current arrangement of things. The Vanderlinde gang, led by the charismatic and deeply complicated Dutch Vanderlinde, is running. They have always been running. Movement is the texture of their lives. But now the running has a different quality, a desperation it did not previously carry. There is less space ahead, and considerably more consequence behind. Arthur Morgan is Dutch's right hand, and has been for over 2 decades. He was taken in off the streets as a young teenager by Dutch and Dutch's closest friend and partner, Hosea Matthews, shaped by Dutch's philosophy of freedom and self-determination, made loyal in the way that only someone who was given a home when they had nothing can truly be loyal. He kills when the situation calls for it. He intimidates, robs, schemes. He is not a good man in the clean, uncomplicated sense. But he has always carried something deeper than his circumstances suggested, a sensitivity, a quiet artistic impulse that finds its expression in the journal he keeps, in the sketches of animals and landscapes that fill its pages, in the way he notices things that a man moving only for survival would move past without registering, and lingers on them in writing, when everything about the world he lives in actively discourages that kind of attention. And then, roughly 2/3 of the way through the game's 6 main chapters, Arthur receives a diagnosis: tuberculosis, a disease for which, in 1899, there is no effective treatment and no cure. The antibiotic that would eventually make tuberculosis survivable, streptomycin, would not be developed for another 40 years. Arthur contracted it from a man he was roughing up for a debt. The blood of a sick man coughed into his face during an act of routine violence on behalf of the gang's loan sharking operation. The disease that will kill him came directly from him doing the thing he has always done, without particular reflection, using his strength against someone weaker. And that is exactly the kind of consequence this game believes in. Not punishment in a tidy moral fable sense, not a cosmic correction where the bad man gets what is coming to him in a proportional and satisfying way, but consequence in the way that actual life tends to deliver it. Quiet, specific, not fully proportional, not always fair, but always real, and always irreversible. What follows across the remainder of the game is Arthur Morgan attempting to understand who he is before he runs out of time to be anyone at all. And the lessons that emerge from watching that unfold, from following that process across the rest of the story, are the ones we are going to explore tonight, one section at a time, slowly, without hurrying. So get comfortable right now. Pull whatever it is you reach for closer, the blanket, the pillow, the particular darkness you like. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop. Breathe out the day fully before you take the next breath in, because we are going to be here a while, and that is the point. We are going to move through this world the way it deserves to be moved through, the way Arthur rode when he was not being chased. With the particular quality of attention, the game rewards when you stop trying to get somewhere and start trying to actually be somewhere. Before we go any further, drop a comment with the time and the place you are watching from. It could be 3 a.m. in a city apartment with the ambient sounds of traffic and the distant glow of streetlights coming under the curtains. It could be a quiet evening in a small town somewhere. It could be any of 100 situations that bring someone to a video like this at whatever hour you found it. That information matters. It makes this feel like what it actually is, a group of people in different places and different circumstances choosing to slow down together for a little while. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a good moment for that. This kind of content takes time to find its audience. Having you here means more than the numbers reflect. Now, let us begin. And one more thing before we do. The way this script is written, it is meant to be listened to at a particular pace, not rushed, not skimmed. If you are watching this in the background while you are doing something else, that is fine. That is your time and your choice. But if you have the option to just be here, just be lying down or sitting still with this as the only thing happening, that is the version of this that the game itself would recommend. The game recommends slowness. it rewards it. And tonight, so does this. The world of Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of the few constructed environments in any medium that genuinely rewards presence. Not the performance of presence, not multitasking with half an ear turned toward it, but actual full attention, the kind where you notice the light and the sound and the specific texture of the moment you are inside. That quality is what we are trying to bring into the audio and the pacing and the language of this script. It is what the game itself does for people willing to slow down enough to receive it. Now, let us actually begin. Chapter 1, The Lesson of Slowing Down. There is a thing that happens to almost every person who picks up Red Dead Redemption 2, particularly in their first hours with it. They feel the pull of impatience. The opening sequence is set in a blizzard, the gang having fled a catastrophically botched robbery and now stranded in the snow-covered mountains of Ambarino, the game's northern region. The cold is rendered with a specificity that the combination of visuals and sound design makes you feel even through a screen. Everything moves slowly. Movement through deep snow requires effort. The horses labor against the weather. Missions require riding significant distances across terrain that actively resists the urgency of the player's desire to progress. There is no fast travel at the start. You cannot skip the horse animations. You cannot rush past conversations. The game holds your impatience at arm's length and does not apologize for it. For players accustomed to the constant stimulation rhythm of modern entertainment and most modern games, those first hours can feel like a test of tolerance. And then, for most people who give the game the patience it is asking for, something shifts. It shifts at different points for different people. For some, it is a specific mission where the world's depth becomes undeniable. For others, it is a random encounter that turns unexpectedly moving. For others, it is simply a moment of riding through a landscape at the wrong time of day for any particular goal. The sun doing something specific to the light on the water of the Dakota River and realizing with a kind of quiet surprise that you stopped trying to get somewhere and started simply being somewhere. And in that shift, the entire game transforms. From something requiring patience into something offering rest. When you stop trying to push through Red Dead Redemption 2, and begin accepting the pace it is setting, the game reveals itself as one of the most genuinely restorative experiences available in any medium. The world is so densely detailed, so full of life happening in the background, completely independent of the player's presence, so textured with the sounds and light and movement of a living ecosystem, that simply existing inside it starts to produce the particular quality of calm that comes from being in a place that is bigger and older and more quietly beautiful than the urgency you brought with you. You ride out of camp on a clear morning, and the sun is still low, throwing long shadows across the grassland that sways in a light wind, and there is a great blue heron standing absolutely still at the edge of a creek, watching the water with the particular patience that herons actually have in the real world, and you can stop and watch it for as long as you want. The heron will stand there, the water will move, the light will shift, the world will quietly do what it does. Nothing is demanding your attention. Nothing is telling you that you should be somewhere else. Nothing will punish you for not moving. This is the first lesson the game teaches, and it is one of the more genuinely radical ideas available in the contemporary world. Slowing down is not wasted time. It is not laziness or avoidance or a failure to be productive. It is a form of living that produces things rushing cannot produce. Clarity, for one. The actual experience of being a person in a moment, rather than an entity executing its way through one. The ability to notice what is actually present in the world around you, rather than seeing only what you are moving through on the way to the next obligation. Arthur Morgan's journal is the clearest and most specific expression of this. The journal updates throughout the game, filling with Arthur's handwritten observations and sketches of the world he is moving through. If you examine every entry, a full playthrough can produce something close to 500 pages of this material. Sketches of individual animal species done with genuine care and accuracy. Landscape drawings of places Arthur rides through alone, sometimes at night. The particular quality of a certain valley, rendered in pencil with more feeling than a man of Arthur's background, has any particular reason to have developed. Personal reflections on camp life, on the state of the gang, on Dutch's increasingly erratic behavior, on the specific things Arthur is turning over in his mind, in the hours between the urgent tasks the gang generates constantly. This journal did not have to be as detailed as it is. Nothing in the game's design requires it. The journal could have been a simple mission log, a record of objectives completed, and the game would have functioned identically from a mechanical standpoint. Instead, someone at Rockstar made the decision to build something that functions as a window into a rich inner life, one that the game never calls attention to explicitly, one that a player could theoretically never notice and would still complete the game perfectly well without. The journal exists because it was true to the character. Because a man who carries that much inside him and lives a life that rarely makes space for it would find some outlet, and the outlet he found was the private page. Arthur sketches deer he encounters while hunting, documenting their specific postures and the quality of the light around them. He writes about conversations at camp with a thoughtfulness that the conversations themselves, in their direct form, rarely reveal. He reflects on the things he has done and the things he regrets and the things he wants and the things he is afraid of, in a voice that is both plain-spoken and unexpectedly beautiful, the voice of a man who reads more than people expect and thinks more than he lets on. What the journal reveals is that Arthur has always been paying attention to the world in a way that the world he lives in does not reward. The life of an outlaw does not provide much space or incentive for the kind of slow, careful observation that Arthur's journal reflects. But he developed it anyway. He cultivated the capacity to notice, and through that capacity, he is living more fully than most of the people around him, even though his material circumstances are considerably more difficult. There is a philosophy in this that many people rediscover at some specific point in their lives, usually after a period of moving too fast through time. When you slow down enough to actually inhabit your life, rather than execute your way through it, things that were invisible begin to matter. The quality of a particular evening becomes something you can actually feel, rather than something to get past. The conversation with a person you might otherwise have rushed through accumulates meaning rather than evaporating the moment it is over. The texture of an ordinary day, the specific weight of the light through a window at a particular hour, or the sound of a street you know well at a time of day you rarely pay attention to, starts to register as something worth holding in your attention for a moment before it passes. And it does pass. Everything passes. But it passes differently if you were actually there when it happened. The Heartlands, the wide grass country in the center of the game's map, bordered by the flat iron lake to the south and the forested hills of New Hanover to the north, is one of the places where the game's quality of rewarding presence is most fully realized. Ride through the Heartlands at different times of day in different weather, and you are riding through a place that has been genuinely transformed by conditions that have nothing to do with the mission objective. Dawn in the Heartlands comes in visible layers. The darkness breaks into gray, and then into a deep purple that lightens at the horizon before the first actual color comes. Then the orange arrives at the edges of the sky, and it deepens and warms and spreads, and the grass lights up with it, each blade catching the early light at its own particular angle, the whole expanse of it moving in a light wind that has just come up with the sun. Hawks begin to move in the upper air, riding thermal columns that are not yet visible, but are already there. The world is waking up, and the sounds of it waking up, the birds, the insects, the far-off sound of the river, happen in a sequence you can actually follow if you are moving slowly enough. Ride that same stretch at dusk, and it is a completely different place. The light is warmer and deeper, more golden, with a horizontal quality that the higher sun never has. The shadows are already long, and they point east. The grass catches the last of the direct light and holds it for a few minutes as the sun drops below the visible horizon, and then the blue comes, the specific blue of that interval between sunset and full dark that photographers have a name for, and that most people notice maybe once or twice in their lives, in a way that they remember. The game renders this every evening, every time you happen to be out in the open land when it occurs. These are the kinds of details that exist in a world being fully inhabited rather than efficiently managed. They do not advance any plot point. They do not unlock anything. They exist because the people who built this world believed that beauty is worth building, that the world a player spends dozens of hours inside should reward attention with something real, and that the alternative to building a world like this, the alternative of building only the parts that serve immediate mechanical purposes, produces an experience that is hollower than most players can clearly identify, but many can distinctly feel. The principle extends beyond games into the way people inhabit their actual lives. The world you actually live in, whatever its specific geography, whatever its relationship to beauty, is fuller of it than the pace most people move at, allows them to notice. The slowing down that the game practices and rewards is available in your life too. Not always easily, not without deliberate choice, but genuinely available. Arthur's tuberculosis diagnosis does a specific and significant thing to his experience of time. The possibility of deferral, always available before the diagnosis, is removed. The usual assumption of unlimited future time, the mental posture that allows most people to put off the noticing and the paying attention, and the honest sitting with their own experience until some better, less pressured, more suitable future moment is simply no longer there. The time is not unlimited. The time is finite and specific, and getting shorter in a way Arthur can feel in his body. And so the time available right now becomes the only time there actually is. Not in theory or as a philosophical position, but as a practical fact. This is the first thing the game teaches, and it teaches it through every design decision, through the journal and the landscape and the quality of the light and the heron standing at the edge of the creek, watching the water with the patience that herons have. Through Arthur sketching that heron in his journal late at night and writing about the particular quality of the morning it represented. The slowness is the point. The presence is the lesson. The rest, everything else, everything that follows in the sections to come, grows from this root. Chapter 2. The Weight of Who You Have Been. Arthur Morgan did not choose his life in the way that term usually suggests. Or rather, he made choices continuously throughout it, but the framework within which those choices were available was not one he selected from a neutral starting point. He was a teenager on the streets of some unnamed city when Dutch Vanderlinde and Hosea Matthews found him, and the city streets were doing to him what city streets in 1880 did to young men with no family and no resources and no particular claim on the world's protection. They were making him hard and small in the specific way that survival without support makes a person hard and small. Dutch and Hosea changed that. They took him in, taught him to read and write, to ride, to shoot. They gave him a place in a community that had rules and loyalty and the specific warmth of people who choose to take care of each other. They gave him an identity too, which is the double-edged gift that parental figures give to young people whose characters are still forming. The identity they gave Arthur was the identity of a loyal enforcer, a man who could be counted on to handle the hard things, who could go where the danger was and come back, who could be trusted with the work that required both capability and absolute discretion. Arthur became very good at this. He built his life around it. The gang survived a long time, in part because of Arthur's specific quality of controlled and stubborn competence. But that identity always sat a little uneasily on the person underneath it. The journal is the evidence of this. You do not sketch deer with that level of patient observation. You do not write about your gang members in those carefully felt terms. You do not notice the quality of the light at 5 a.m. over the heartlands with that kind of specificity, unless something in you is consistently reaching towards something that the role you occupy does not require and does not particularly reward. Arthur's inner life was always richer and more contradictory than the life he was living on the surface. He just rarely had occasion to examine that, or to sit with what the examination revealed, because the pace and the demands of the life he was living made honest self-examination a luxury the schedule did not support. The tuberculosis diagnosis removes that scheduling conflict. Whatever else it takes from him, it gives him time of a specific kind, time that has the quality of something rare and therefore not to be wasted. And Arthur begins, gradually and imperfectly, to actually look at the life he has been living. This is something a significant number of people recognize from their own experience, almost always at a smaller scale than a terminal diagnosis, but recognizable in its essential structure. There comes a point for many people when the life they have been living, through some combination of circumstance and accumulated choice, and the particular momentum that results from not stopping to question the direction you are traveling, starts to look different from a certain distance. When you step back far enough to see not just individual decisions, but the pattern they form when you put them all together. And sometimes what you see when you look at that pattern is not entirely what you would have chosen if you had been more deliberate, more awake to yourself, more honest about what you actually wanted and what you were actually doing, and whether those two things had any particular relationship to each other. The past is always present in this game. It is built into the structure of the story in multiple ways. As a prequel to the first Red Dead Redemption, RDR2 is set in a timeline that players of the original game already know will unfold in a specific direction. The shadow of what is coming falls across every scene for anyone with that knowledge. And the characters themselves are weighted down by their own histories, the things they have done that cannot be undone, the choices that narrowed the available road in ways they can see clearly now, but could not when they were making them. The momentum of a life built around certain commitments, to the gang, to Dutch, to the ideology of freedom and self-determination that Dutch preaches, that has been operating for so long, it has become indistinguishable from the person who built it. Dutch's past follows him as reputation, as the specific profile that draws Pinkerton agents to every town the gang tries to settle in. Arthur's past follows him in the physical form of tuberculosis. Contracted through the blood of a sick man, he was beating up for a debt collection that was itself a routine expression of the gang's loan sharking operation. The gang's collective past follows them all in the shape of Blackwater, the robbery that went catastrophically wrong before the game begins, that cost lives and created the legal heat they are running from at the story's opening, a disaster whose consequences define the shape of everything that follows. The game does not present the past as something that can be undone or properly escaped. Arthur cannot reverse the beating of Thomas Downs that gave him the tuberculosis. He cannot undo the violence of decades of outlaw life. He cannot restore what has been taken from the people he has robbed and threatened and hurt. The choices are made. The consequences are in motion. One of the qualities that makes this game as emotionally honest as it is, one of the things that makes it feel more like literature than like most games, is its categorical refusal to pretend otherwise. There are no magic reversals. There is no sequence of good behavior that erases what came before it. Arthur will die of tuberculosis, regardless of whether you play him as a saint in his final months. The disease operates on its own schedule. What can change is the relationship to the past. And this is where the game offers something genuinely useful, rather than merely accurate, to the person paying attention. Arthur's arc at its most essential is about learning to hold his past differently, not to pretend it does not exist, not to minimize or explain away, or construct elaborate justifications for the harm he has caused. The game does not offer any of that, and Arthur, at his most honest, does not seek it. But also, not letting the accumulated weight of what he has done in the wrong direction become the permanent excuse for continuing in that direction. Not using the past as a reason the present has already been decided. There is a specific version of guilt that is useful, that sees clearly what went wrong, and uses that clarity to make different choices going forward. And there is a version of guilt that simply paralyzes, that says the past is so heavy and so irreversible that any attempt to be better now is both insufficient and somehow dishonest, a kind of audacity given the record. If you are simply a bad man, and that is the whole truth of you, the question of who you could still become is safely off the table. Arthur deploys this version of the story when people offer him the opportunity to be kinder or more honest than his history suggests. He calls himself a bad man. He deflects. He says he is what he is, which is partly true and partly a way of declining the discomfort of actually trying. The tuberculosis removes that particular exit. When the time remaining is genuinely finite, the question of who you want to have been, as opposed to who you simply are by default, becomes urgent in a way it was not before. There is a moment in the game when Arthur returns to the Downs widow, the wife of the man whose tuberculosis he contracted during the debt collection. He sees what has become of her life in the absence of her husband. The sight of her lands differently than the original event did, because he is seeing it now from inside the full context of what that act set in motion. Not as a transaction, not as a professional doing the gang's business, but as a man who understands, with a clarity he did not have at the time, what he contributed to the particular shape of this woman's suffering. And the seeing of it, the willingness to actually look at the consequence rather than move past it, begins something in him. What it begins is not redemption in any simple or sentimental sense. Redemption in this game is not a clean arc from bad to good, from wrong to right. with a satisfying resolution that confirms the world is just and efforts are proportionally rewarded. It is something more like a person deciding, even very late, that the kind of person they want to be still matters, that it is worth trying to move the remaining choices in the direction of something better. Not because it erases what came before, but because the alternative is to keep moving in a direction they no longer fully believe in. What Arthur writes in his journal during the late chapters, when the disease has clearly progressed and the time remaining has contracted further, has a different quality from the earlier entries, more direct, less defended. He writes about what he wants for John, about what he wishes for the people he cares about the specific things he regrets in terms that are honest rather than managed. He is not generous with himself, but he is accurate, and in the accuracy there is a kind of peace that is not available in either the inflation of self-congratulation or the spiral of self-condemnation. The past does not disappear. Its weight is real, and its consequences have a way of following a person along paths that are not always visible until they arrive. But the weight of the past does not determine what you do with today. And today, whatever its limitations, whatever it carries from everything that came before it, is the only day in which any living actually occurs. Arthur Morgan understood this, finally, in the final months of a life that had taken a long time, to slow down enough for the understanding to arrive. Tonight, if there are things from your own past that have a tendency to surface in the dark, the way they tend to surface in the quiet when the day's noise stops covering them, the game's approach is worth sitting with. Not avoidance, because avoidance does not actually make them smaller, it just relocates them. And not spiral, because spiral does not produce clarity, something closer to what Arthur does in the journal, seeing what is there, writing it down, in whatever form that takes for you, setting it on the page or in the thought, and then, gently, letting the page close for tonight. Chapter 3. The Art of Letting Go. Dutch van der Linde is one of the most carefully and devastatingly constructed figures in the history of storytelling through games. He is not a villain in the familiar sense, not at first, not in the way the game frames him across its opening hours. He is a true believer. He is a man who built his entire identity around a coherent and genuinely appealing set of ideas about freedom and self-determination, about the moral bankruptcy of a civilization that claimed to represent progress while actually representing the organized extraction of resources from the many to the benefit of the few. These ideas were not entirely wrong. Dutch was not preaching pure nonsense. His critique of industrial capitalism, of the Pinkertons as a private army serving the interests of the wealthy rather than any genuine notion of justice, of the way the frontier was being enclosed and its inhabitants dispossessed, was an accurate critique. He was, in a real sense, reading the world correctly. He was also a genuinely gifted leader in the years when the gang was at its best. The stories people tell about those years, the early days when Dutch and Hosea and Arthur were still finding out who they were together, when the gang was small enough to be intimate and the vision was large enough to be compelling, paint a picture of a community that was imperfect and criminal, but also genuinely trying to embody something. They robbed from the powerful. They gave money to the poor, at least sometimes. They took in people who had nowhere else to go. They made a home out of people who were otherwise homeless. The problem was not that Dutch's ideas were false. The problem was that Dutch could not let go of them when the evidence of their inadequacy in the actual conditions of 1,899 began to accumulate in ways that could not be ignored by anyone willing to look directly at the evidence. The world changed. The frontier closed. The spaces in which an outlaw gang could operate with any hope of survival shrank year by year, as lawmen backed by industrial money moved into territories that had previously been ungoverned. The life that Dutch had built his entire vision around, the life of the free outlaw moving through a world too large and too open to be fully controlled, was becoming structurally impossible, not because of any moral failure, not because Dutch had become corrupt or the gang had lost its way, at least not initially, simply because time moved and circumstances changed, and the world that had made the van der Linde gang's particular kind of existence possible was running out. Dutch's response to this was not to update his understanding. It was to hold tighter, to insist with increasing forcefulness, to interpret every piece of evidence that contradicted the viability of his vision, not as honest feedback from the world, but as evidence of betrayal, of weakness in others, of the machinations of enemies. He moved from plan to plan in the game's middle and later sections, with a visible desperation. Each new scheme described to the gang as the final score that would give them enough to finally get away, to the mythical destination where they could be free, somewhere sufficiently far and sufficiently ungoverned that the world's encroachment could not reach them. Each plan was more violent than the last. Each failure generated more casualties. And after each failure, rather than reconsidering the direction, Dutch found new explanations for why the failure was not really the plan's fault. When gang members expressed concern, when Hosea urged caution, when Arthur articulated doubts about specific decisions, Dutch did not hear those voices as what they actually were, which was people who loved him trying to keep him honest. He heard them as disloyalty, as betrayal, as the specific kind of weakness he could not tolerate in a vision that required unconditional faith to sustain. The circle of people he could hear narrowed as the pressure increased, until the only voice he could receive without becoming defensive was the voice of Micah Bell, who had no investment in Dutch's well-being whatsoever, but an enormous investment in Dutch's usefulness to Micah's own survival. The Steam community and the forums and years of discussions about this game have identified what Dutch goes through as a form of sunk cost escalation, which is the psychological phenomenon where a person increases their commitment to a failing strategy in proportion to what they have already invested in it, because acknowledging the failure would require acknowledging that the investment was wasted. The deeper the investment, the harder the acknowledgement becomes. Dutch had invested everything, his whole identity, his whole life's meaning, the love of the people who mattered most to him, in the vision of the free outlaw and the ideology that justified it. Letting go of the ideology meant letting go of who Dutch was. And Dutch could not do that. This mechanism, the inability to let go of what has stopped working because the letting go requires a kind of self-revision that the ego protects against, is one of the most recognizable and most costly patterns in human psychology. It operates in individuals, and it operates in institutions. It operates in relationships where people stay long past the point where staying serves either person, because leaving requires admitting that the time and hope invested did not produce what was promised. It operates in careers and belief systems, and political affiliations, and any other domain where identity has become sufficiently enmeshed with position that changing the position feels like losing the self. Hosea Matthews is Dutch's counterpart in this. He loved Dutch with genuine and long-standing depth. They had known each other for more than 20 years by the events of the game. They had built the gang together, weathered impossible situations together, shaped each other in ways that deep friendship always shapes the people involved. But Hosea had the capacity for honesty about what was actually happening that Dutch had lost. He could look at the situation clearly and name what it was. He could say the plan is not going to work, and hear that as useful information, rather than as a threat to his sense of himself. He preferred avoiding violence, preferred the elegant con to the brute force robbery, had a craftsman's pride in his work that was entirely about the quality of the execution and not about the ideology surrounding it. Hosea saw what was coming. He said so, in various ways, across the game's middle chapters. He tried to talk Dutch back from the edge of decisions that were going to cost them badly. He was the rock that had held Dutch together across 20 years of impossible situations, the person whose honest counsel and genuine friendship had consistently provided the tether to reality that Dutch's charisma and vision could not provide for themselves. And then Hosea was killed. In front of Dutch, by the Pinkerton agent Andrew Milton, at the St. Denis bank robbery, that was itself a manifestation of exactly the escalating pattern Hosea had been trying to pull Dutch back from. The death of the person who served as Dutch's anchor to reality, at a moment when Dutch was already under enormous pressure and already moving in a direction that was losing him faster than he knew, was catastrophic. Not just emotionally, though that cost was real, functionally. With Hosea gone, Dutch lost the only voice he could actually hear, and the vacuum was immediately filled by the one voice that was the least honest and the most dangerous. The lesson in all of this is not simple or easy. It does not reduce to a slogan. What the game demonstrates through Dutch's trajectory is something specific and worth sitting with fully. The things we cannot let go of, the beliefs and plans and identities and grievances that we protect most fiercely from honest examination, are often not the things most worth protecting. They are the things whose worth is most precarious, whose survival depends on not being looked at too directly. The things that can withstand honest examination do not need the protection. They are still standing after the looking. The things that cannot withstand it collapse when the looking happens, and the collapse, as painful as it is the beginning of something more real. What Arthur reaches, in the final section of the game, is something genuinely earned and genuinely hard to achieve. It is not resignation, which is passive and defeated, and still tied to the thing being given up. It is something more active, more honest, more like a clearing. He has looked at the evidence of his own life with the full honesty that the proximity of death makes possible, and he has decided what matters now with a clarity unavailable to him at any earlier point. He cannot save everyone. He knows this. He cannot undo what was done. He knows this too. What he can do, in the time remaining, is act in ways that align with who he wants to have been. He can do the things that matter for the people he loves. He can make choices that he can stand behind when there is no more time for revision. That specific quality of acceptance, the kind that does not deny the loss but also does not let the loss foreclose the possibility of the present moment, is one of the harder things to find, and one of the more valuable things available when you do find it. It is the opposite of both denial and despair. It is the honest middle place where actual living happens. Tonight, if there are things you are holding that have stopped rewarding the holding, if there are plans or beliefs or versions of yourself that you have been protecting from the honest examination that might require changing them, the game's gentle suggestion is simply this: the clearing does not destroy the self. It makes more of the self available for what actually remains. Chapter 4. The People You Ride With. The Vanderlinde gang at the start of Red Dead Redemption 2, when they are camped at Horseshoe Overlook in Chapter 2 Inches, the milder weather of the New Hanover grasslands, is a community that is working, not perfectly, not without the specific irritations and tensions that any group of distinct personalities living in close proximity will inevitably generate, but genuinely, in the essential sense. The camp is alive with people cooking and gambling and practicing their instruments and arguing about small things and telling stories at the fire after dinner. There is a specific feeling in that camp in those early hours of the game that is recognizable to anyone who has ever been part of a community where people genuinely care about each other. It is the feeling of belonging to something, of being among people who will, if it comes to it, show up for you. The conversations that play out in camp, the ones you can overhear by walking through the space slowly and not immediately sprinting to the next mission marker, are some of the game's quietest achievements. Lenny Summers talking to Hosea about books, because Hosea is one of the people who has been quietly encouraging Lenny's reading. Pearson the cook arguing genially with anyone who wanders too close to his kitchen about whether they are properly appreciating the difficulty of what he produces under the available conditions. Abigail watching Jack and the particular quality of parental attention she brings to it, simultaneous love and worry, and the specific exhaustion of caring for a child in circumstances that have no comfortable provisions for childhood. Charles Smith sitting alone somewhere at the edge of camp with a quiet that is not unfriendly, simply complete in itself, the silence of a man who does not require noise to feel at ease. These conversations and these presences build something real in the player's experience of the game. They make the camp feel inhabited rather than populated. They make the people in it feel specific rather than generic. And they set up the emotional architecture that makes everything the game does with those characters later work the way it works. You cannot grieve the loss of something you never fully had. The game makes sure you fully have it before it starts taking it away. Arthur's relationships within the gang are complicated in the way that long-standing relationships in difficult circumstances are always complicated. There is genuine affection and genuine friction, the specific dynamic of people who have been through things together that no one outside the situation could fully understand, who have built their trust on the specific evidence of how each other behaves when the situation is bad, rather than on the easier evidence of how they behave when it is good. Hosea and Arthur have the relationship of a man who was something like a father and a man who was something like a son, mediated by the 20 years of living inside the same gang, and the particular respect that comes from watching someone consistently demonstrate their quality over time. Their conversations have a specific warmth and a specific honesty that Arthur's conversations with almost anyone else lack. Hosea can say hard things to Arthur, and Arthur can receive them. Arthur can say hard things to Hosea, and they will be considered rather than deflected. This is the quality of relationship that makes the most positive difference in a person's actual life. Not the relationship that tells you what you want to hear, but the one that tells you what you need to know. Charles Smith is another character who builds something real across the game's middle sections. He is one of the most morally consistent figures in the game, carrying his values quietly and acting on them without requiring acknowledgement or reward for the acting. He is honest when honesty is uncomfortable. He declines to follow orders that cross lines he cannot cross, not dramatically or with extended explanation, simply by not crossing them and accepting the friction that generates. He offers genuine affection in the understated way that some people express feeling, the affection of someone who does not perform warmth, but is actually warm, which is a different and rarer thing. Arthur and Charles have an easy companionship built on shared respect and the specific compatibility of two people who are both more interior than the world they move through has occasion to notice. Their scenes together have a quality of two people who understand each other without requiring extensive translation, who can ride in silence and have that silence be comfortable rather than loaded. This kind of friendship, the kind where the other person's presence is genuinely restful rather than demanding, is one of the more valuable things available in a human life and one of the harder things to find and sustain. Micah Bell is the counterexample, and he is constructed with the specific deliberateness of someone who is meant to teach something through contrast. He is loud, self-serving, contemptuous of weakness in anyone he perceives as weaker than himself, and comprehensively uninterested in the welfare of any member of the gang except as their welfare serves his own immediate purposes. His stated philosophy, expressed more than once in direct dialogue, is that the world consists of winners and losers and nothing else. Loyalty for Micah is a tool for extracting commitment from others, rather than a genuine mutual obligation. The moment loyalty becomes inconvenient to his interests, he discards it without any particular conflict, because he never actually felt it in the first place. What Micah exploits, and what makes him more instructive than a simple villain, is a specific vulnerability in Dutch. Dutch needs to be believed in. He needs unconditional faith, the kind that does not come with questions or concerns attached. He needs to look out at the camp and see people who trust his vision completely. As the pressure on the gang increases and the evidence against the viability of that vision accumulates, the number of people who can offer Dutch that unconditional faith decreases. Hosea has too much experience and too much genuine concern to offer it. Arthur has too long a history with Dutch and too much personal integrity to lie about what he sees. But Micah, who has no investment in Dutch's vision and no affection for Dutch as a person, is perfectly positioned to offer exactly the unconditional agreement that Dutch's psychological needs have made him hungry for, and he does, strategically and without scruple. This dynamic, the charismatic leader whose need for validation makes him susceptible to the one person willing to provide it without reservation, whose need is then exploited by someone who recognized the vulnerability and moved to fill it, is not specific to outlaw gangs or to fiction. It is a pattern that appears in human systems at every scale, in families and organizations and political movements, and any other domain where the need for certain kinds of affirmation can be weaponized by someone skilled at providing them. The practical lesson of the gang, the one that applies beyond the specific Western setting, is about who you choose to ride with and what kind of company consistently costs you versus what kind consistently builds you. The people who tell you the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable and even when there would be an easier lie available are not the ones making your life harder. They are the ones most invested in your actual well-being, rather than your momentary comfort. The people who only tell you what you want to hear, who find the specific angle from which every idea you have looks like a good one, and every concern others raise looks like a failure of faith, are usually the ones who most need something from you and are least interested in giving something back. Sadie Adler's arc in the game demonstrates something important and separate from the above. She arrives having lost her entire world in a single catastrophic night. Her husband is dead. Her home is destroyed. She has nothing except the quality of herself, which at that moment is expressed primarily as grief and a controlled fury that she does not yet know what to do with. The gang takes her in. They do not require her to process the grief on any particular timeline or in any particular way. They simply provide the context and the community within which she can begin, gradually, to figure out who she is now that the life she had organized around is gone. What the gang gives Sadie that allows her trajectory is not comfort in the simple sense. It is responsibility, things to do, ways to be useful, the specific care that recognizes a person in crisis as someone who needs engagement as much as sympathy, someone who needs to be allowed to discover their own capacity rather than simply supported in their devastation. Sadie becomes formidable. She becomes one of the most capable members of the gang. She does this not by leaving the grief behind, but by moving through it with the support of people who did not require her to be only one thing at a time. The quality of the people around you in the hard times is not a peripheral concern. It is the central variable in whether the hard times make you or diminish you. Arthur knew this about his gang at their best, and grieved it, quietly and in writing, as the gang he had known became something different under the combined pressures of the world closing in and Dutch's grip on reality loosening. Chapter 5. When the world changes around you. The year 1899 is not an arbitrary number. Rockstar Games chose it with the same deliberateness they brought to every other aspect of the game's design. The turn of a century carries its own symbolic weight in the human imagination, the sense of an era ending and another beginning, of the particular texture of time that comes when the calendar itself suggests a hinge point. But the symbolic weight is backed by historical reality. 1,899 inches. America was genuinely a year on the edge of transformation. The 1,890 United States Census had officially noted the closing of the frontier, the observation that the contiguous settled territory of the country had filled in to the point where a meaningful line between civilization and wilderness no longer existed. The observation was statistical and bureaucratic, and also somehow epical. It described the end of an entire phase of the American story, the 3 centuries of westward expansion that had defined the country's mythology and self-image, the sense that there was always more country ahead, always more open space, always another horizon to move toward. By 1899, the consequences of that closing were being felt everywhere the Vanderlinde gang tried to operate. The territories that had previously offered enough ungoverned space for outlaws to move through with reasonable safety were filling in with the infrastructure of governance, railroads, telegraph lines, law enforcement with backing from the same industrial capital that had built the railroads, Pinkerton agents functioning as a private military at the service of wealthy interests. The mechanisms of state power, which had lagged behind the speed of the frontier's expansion for most of the century, were catching up with a technological efficiency that had not been available to earlier generations. Arthur articulates the experience of this from the inside in one of the game's most quoted lines. "We are thieves in a world that does not want us anymore." And elsewhere, with a slightly different inflection, "I wish things were different." But it was not us who changed. The second statement is both true and not quite the whole truth, which is exactly the kind of complexity the game is comfortable sitting in. The world did change around the gang in ways that were largely beyond any individual's control. The frontier did close. The space for outlaws to operate did shrink. These were real forces and real changes, and the gang did not create them. But the gang also failed to change when change was genuinely possible. Dutch's vision was built for a world that no longer existed, and his inability to let that vision update was not entirely the world's fault. The game explores what it feels like to be inside a changing world from the perspective of people who are being changed around, rather than changing with it. Every chapter moves the gang to a different location, and each location is slightly more enclosed, slightly more watched, slightly more fully integrated into the structures of a civilization that is hostile to the gang's existence. The early chapters, set in the relative openness of West Elizabeth and New Hanover, still have the texture of a frontier that is present even if diminishing. The later chapters, set in the more settled and socially stratified territories of Lemoyne and the city of Saint Denis, feel unmistakably like a world that has moved on. St. Denis, the game's version of New Orleans, is a city of electricity and industry and social complexity and organized crime so thick it has become part of the official structure. It is beautiful and corrupt and completely indifferent to the particular values of the Vanderlinde gang. The gang looks in from the outside and sees a world that has no place for them. This experience of being the kind of person whose particular formation and set of skills fits a world that is changing into something different is not historically specific. It is an experience that every generation has in some form, and that individuals within generations have repeatedly across the course of a single life. Industries transform. The skills that made you valuable for 20 years become less relevant as the industry shifts. The community you grew up in changes shape under economic or demographic pressures until it resembles your memory of it only in geography. The relationship that organized a significant part of your identity ends or changes in ways that require you to find out who you are without it. The game's treatment of the Native American characters, particularly Rains Fall and his son Eagle Flies and the Wapiti tribe they lead, explores the same theme with a depth of historical awareness and a magnitude of loss that makes the gang's situation look modest by comparison. The Wapiti are living through the final phase of the destruction of their world, a process that has been ongoing for generations and that is now in its terminal stage. Their territory is being taken for oil extraction. Their way of life is being systematically dismantled not by time alone, but by deliberate policy, backed by military force and legal mechanisms that have been designed specifically to make their resistance impossible to sustain. Eagle Flies is consumed by a rage that is completely understandable and ultimately tragic. He cannot sit with the injustice. The injustice is too large and too real and too personally devastating. He needs to act. He needs to fight. He needs to refuse the role of historical victim, being slowly absorbed and erased by the forces that have decided his people have no place in the future being built. Rains Fall, his father, carries a different wisdom. He has seen enough to understand something that Eagle Flies cannot yet see, that the battle his son wants to fight will not save what his son loves, that the costs of fighting it will be borne by the people most precious to them, that there are forms of loss that no amount of courage or resistance can prevent, and that the question of how you carry your love for what is being lost into whatever comes after is different from, and in some ways more important than, the question of whether you can stop the losing. Neither of them is entirely right. Rains Fall is not wrong about the costs. Eagle Flies is not wrong about the injustice. The game does not resolve this tension by crowning one perspective as the correct one. It holds them both honestly and lets the weight of each land as fully as the story allows. Arthur's relationship with both of them, the practical help he offers and the genuine respect he shows for the weight of what they are carrying, is one of the most humanizing threads in his late-game arc. He cannot stop what is happening to the Wapiti tribe. The forces are too large and the structural conditions too fixed. What he can do is show up with honesty and with real effort within the limits of what is actually available to him. He can do the specific thing that is in his hands, rather than either pretending it is more than it is, or declining to do it because it is not enough. Change, in the game's understanding of it, is not something you manage by holding tighter to what is changing. The version of yourself that belongs to the world as it was does not survive the world's changing by virtue of your insistence on its continuity. But there is something in you that is not defined by the world you formed in. Something that can move through change with more integrity and tact than Dutch's arc suggests is inevitable. The character that develops through difficulty rather than in the absence of it. The capacity for honesty and attention and genuine connection that does not require a specific historical moment to remain valuable. John Marston's epilogue, which closes the game's story across several long chapters after Arthur's death, is the argument that change can be navigated rather than only suffered. John is a man who is entirely the product of the world the game has depicted throughout, with no skills that fit easily into the world that is replacing it. He cannot farm. He knows nothing about the patient, unglamorous work of building a home. He is good at violence and strategy, and the specific spatial intelligence of moving through dangerous terrain, none of which has much application to growing crops and building walls. And yet, he tries. He builds a house on the land in Beecher's Hope. He drives nails at wrong angles and cuts boards at imprecise measurements, and the house that goes up is unmistakably the work of someone who is figuring it out as he goes. But it goes up. Slowly, imperfectly, persistently. The house goes up. And John is inside the work of building it with the full weight of his attention, not because the work is comfortable or comes naturally, but because it is the right work for where he is. It is the work of becoming the person the next part of his life requires. Chapter 6. Honesty with yourself. There is a specific quality to the way Arthur Morgan talks about himself when he is being fully honest, a quality that distinguishes him from most protagonists in most games and from most public figures in most media. He does not inflate. He does not construct the elaborate justifications that people typically build around their own histories when those histories are uncomfortable to look at directly. He writes in his journal, in the quiet of the night with no one watching, with a directness about his own failures and inconsistencies that is unusual, and, in the full context of the character and the story, genuinely moving. He describes himself at various points as a fool, as someone who has spent his life doing the wrong things for a man who was always going to lead them somewhere bad, and who cannot fully pretend he did not see this earlier than he admitted it. As someone who got what he deserved, said, not with bitterness or performative self-flagellation, but in the tone of someone doing honest accounting, he does not grade on a curve when it comes to himself. He does not look for the most generous possible interpretation of his own actions. He looks for the most accurate one. But he is also, as the disease progresses and the time remaining contracts, and the question of who he wants to be becomes more urgent than the question of who he has been, not entirely without compassion for the person he finds when he looks honestly. He begins to see the full picture rather than the partial one. The genuine kindnesses that the pace of his life made easy to overlook or discount. The care he has consistently shown for people who had no claim on his protection. The love he has for John and Abigail and Jack, which is real and which has expressed itself in real actions across the whole of their lives together, even when those actions were invisible to everyone, including himself at the time of their performing. This balance between the honesty that does not minimize and the compassion that does not excuse is genuinely difficult to find. Most people resolve the discomfort of self-examination by tipping toward one side or the other. The defensive version constructs elaborate reasons why the things that look like failures are not really failures, why the responsibility lies elsewhere, why the circumstances explain and therefore excuse. The spiral version accepts the failures without any counterweight, building a case against the self that becomes its own form of avoidance, because a self that is simply bad and irredeemable does not have to do the harder work of figuring out how to be better. Arthur's journal practice, the ongoing habit of writing down what is true and sitting with it rather than moving past it, is the mechanism that makes the balance possible. Writing is different from thinking in a specific way that is worth noting. Thinking can circle. It can return repeatedly to the same point without resolution, the same territory of concern, visited again and again in slightly different configurations, but without arriving anywhere new. Writing externalizes the thought. It puts it on the page in a form that can be examined from slightly outside itself, seen as a thing that exists, rather than as a state you are in. And the slight distance that creates is often enough to allow the kind of honest assessment that pure interior experience makes hard to achieve. Dutch, again, is the counterexample. Dutch has constructed a story about himself that he literally cannot allow to be examined, because the examination would require acknowledging things that the story cannot accommodate. The story requires Dutch to be the visionary leader whose plans would succeed if properly supported. The story requires that every failure be explainable through someone else's inadequacy or betrayal. The story requires that Dutch's judgment be essentially correct and that the evidence against it be essentially the result of forces working against him rather than evidence about him. Maintaining this story requires constant energy and constant management of information, and the cost of that maintenance is the genuine connection with reality that leadership of any kind requires to function. You can see the exact moments in the game where Dutch receives information that contradicts the story and chooses not to integrate it, where he reaches for the reassuring explanation rather than the accurate one, where he allows Micah's voice to speak more loudly than Hosea's, because Micah's voice confirms the story and Hosea's complicates it. Each such choice costs something. even if what it costs is not immediately visible. The gap between the story Dutch is telling about himself and the reality of what is happening in front of him grows with each choice, and the work required to bridge that gap grows with the gap until the gap is so large that it has become the defining feature of Dutch's relationship to everything around him. Self-honesty is not a comfortable practice. The game does not suggest it is. It involves sitting regularly with the knowledge of your own inconsistencies and failures, and looking at them without immediately reaching for either the defensive story or the self-punishing spiral. It involves the willingness to ask whether the story you tell about yourself matches what your actual actions look like when you examine them from a slight distance. It involves finding the gap, where it exists, between the person you think you are and the person your choices have been consistently expressing, and sitting with the discomfort of that gap without either collapsing it prematurely through denial or using it as permanent evidence of your own worthlessness. Arthur's high honor ending, the one you receive if you have spent the game making choices that align with decency in the aggregate, places him at the top of a mountain watching his final sunrise. He is dying. That is not in question. The disease has progressed to the point where the physical deterioration is visible. He is not in a comfortable position. He is not at peace in any easy sense, but he is present. He is looking at the world he has loved and moving through without fully inhabiting for most of his life, and he is seeing it clearly, with the full attention that the awareness of ending has finally made possible. And the stag appears in the tree line, standing still, looking back. The stag is the honor symbol the game uses to represent a soul that has been tending in the right direction. It does not appear to reward Arthur for being good, exactly. It appears because Arthur, finally, has been honest enough with himself to become something like who he wanted to be, and the convergence between who you are and who you wanted to be, even imperfect, even late, is worth something. The game believes this. It builds the entire architecture of its honor system around this belief. The consequences of how you lived are real. The quality of how you die is shaped by the choices you made while living. Both things are true simultaneously. There is a version of this available tonight. Not the dramatic version, not the final sunrise version, the ordinary version. The practice of sitting honestly with whatever the day contained, what you did well and what you did not, what you brought into your interactions and what you took from them, without the editorial process that immediately converts the bad into justified or the good into insufficient. Just the looking, just the brief, honest acknowledgement of what was true today, in the same spirit that Arthur wrote it down. Chapter 7. The Quiet Courage of Small Acts. Red Dead Redemption 2 has 31 stranger mission strands scattered through its world. These are conversations and encounters available at various points on the map, usually marked by a question mark symbol, involving characters who are not part of the main narrative and whose situations are entirely independent of the central story of the gang's dissolution. You can help a man recover from a cholera outbreak in a small camp by collecting medicine from a nearby town. You can assist an eccentric naturalist in documenting the wildlife of the region across multiple encounters spread through several chapters. You can encounter a pair of dueling brothers and talk one of them out of going through with it. You can find someone who has been genuinely lost and bring them back to safety. None of these are required. The main story proceeds without them. The world does not appear to remember them in any way that the player can easily see, and yet the honor system is watching. The game tracks these choices not through a prominent visible counter, but through the aggregate of the whole, the accumulation of small decisions made when no dramatic stakes were present and no visible reward was attached. The portrait that the honor system draws from these accumulations is the most honest available representation of a character's moral life, because it is built from the choices made in the routine moments rather than the exceptional ones. This reflects something important about how character actually works in human lives, something that the drama of the exceptional moment tends to obscure. The large, visible choices, the ones where you are clearly tested and clearly choosing between obvious good and obvious bad, are memorable and they matter, but they do not arrive very frequently. The shape of a life, the actual texture of the moral self a person builds across the decades of their existence, is formed overwhelmingly in the small moments. The everyday choices when no one significant is watching, and the right thing is slightly less comfortable than the easier alternative. The 100 small decisions that, in any given week, go entirely unnoted, but that add up across years to a portrait of who you actually are when there is nothing in particular at stake. Arthur's capacity for genuine kindness is one of the game's quietest and most consistent achievements. He is not a good man in the simple sense. He has done bad things in large numbers across a long career of doing them, but the kindness is real, and it runs underneath everything. He gives money to the poor without ceremony, without making it a moment of self-congratulation. He stops to help people whose situations present no strategic value to him whatsoever. He talks to people who are frightened or in pain with a particular gentleness that coexists with the roughness of the rest of his presentation, a tenderness that is neither performed nor performed as its absence. He inherited this from Hosea in part. Hosea was the member of the gang who most consistently treated every person as someone worth taking seriously, who extended genuine interest in the people around him regardless of their status or usefulness, who approached the world with a generosity that was not naivety, but was also genuinely warm. Arthur absorbed this by proximity across 20 years of watching it in practice. The stranger encounter with Evelyn Miller, the naturalist writer who is living alone in the wilderness, trying to complete his life's work documenting the natural world of the region, is one of the most fully developed examples of how the game treats the small act. Miller is difficult. He is prickly, demanding, given to lectures about the inferiority of humans compared to the natural world he is studying, not particularly grateful for the help he receives, and somewhat inconsistent about acknowledging that he needs it. There is nothing about interacting with him that is conventionally rewarding. He does not provide interesting information about the main plot. He does not give you particularly useful equipment. He is simply a man with a passion and a mission and a body that is failing him, trying to finish something that matters to him before he runs out of time to finish it. Arthur keeps showing up for him, not because of any calculated benefit, not because the game rewards him with anything significant for doing so, but because he noticed the situation and decided it was worth helping, which is the basic structure of most small acts of genuine kindness. You notice someone's actual situation, and you decide that the noticing obligates something, not everything, not a complete rearrangement of your own priorities, just the specific thing that is actually in your hands to do for this person right now. Miller works himself to death in the wilderness he loved. He is found there by Arthur on the final visit, having done exactly what he wanted to do with the time he had left. His last wish is to be cremated so his ashes can scatter in the open air over the land he spent his life documenting. Arthur honors this. He burns Miller's cabin. He stands outside in the light of the fire and watches the smoke rise into the sky, and the moment has the specific weight of a small thing done with full attention for someone who needed it done and could not do it themselves. The Wapiti storyline, and Arthur's involvement in it, presents the small act in a different and harder context. He cannot stop what is happening to the tribe. The structural forces are too large, and his capacity to affect them too limited. What he can do is be honest with Rain's Fall about those limits, and then do the specific things within those limits with genuine effort and genuine respect. Show up when it matters. Stand with people who have reason not to trust him. Be present in the particular way that is available to him, even when the grand resolution is not. Rain's Fall's observation to Arthur near the end of their time together, that he has met few genuinely good men but many who tried, is one of the game's most quietly powerful lines. It functions as both an honest observation and a form of recognition. Arthur is not a good man by any clean accounting, but he is a man who is trying, and the trying, in Rain's Fall's wisdom, is not nothing. It is, in fact, considerably more than nothing. The game rewards high honor not only with narrative variations, but with the qualitative experience of Arthur's end. The stag, the sunrise, the particular quality of a death that, for all its tragedy, has the texture of something that was reaching toward the light rather than away from it. This is the game's most direct argument for the value of consistent small acts. Not because they change the large outcomes, which they often do not, but because they change who you are in the process of making them. Each small act of choosing decency, of stopping when you could have kept going, of being honest when a convenient lie was available, of treating someone with the patience they did not necessarily earn, is a small act of becoming. You are building the person you will need to be when the larger moments arrive. Chapter 8. What Facing the End Teaches the Living. Arthur Morgan's tuberculosis is, in a functional sense, a gift the narrative gives him. This sounds wrong when stated plainly, and it is not a simple statement. A terminal diagnosis at the height of a man's life is genuinely terrible. The loss is real, and the suffering is real. But the specific thing the diagnosis does to Arthur's experience of time, to his relationship with every remaining choice, to the quality of attention he brings to the world around him, is something that would not have been available to him any other way. He was moving too fast through his life. The constant urgency of the gang's existence, the perpetual series of crises and demands and requirements, meant that the deeper questions, who am I actually, what actually matters, how do I want to spend the time I have, were always deferrable. There would be a moment later when things calmed down. There would be a period of quieter time when the examination could happen. There was always a better time ahead. The diagnosis removes the later. There is only now, not in a sentimental bumper sticker sense, but as a practical fact about the structure of time remaining. And so, the quality of now changes. The things Arthur pays attention to change. The things he worries about change. The relationships he invests in change. The decisions he makes about how to use a given hour change. This is the thing that direct confrontations with mortality do. The thing that the comfortable parts of modern culture tend to both acknowledge and deflect. Death clarifies, brutally sometimes, but usefully. When the background assumption of effectively unlimited future time is removed, the choices available in the present become more specific and more weighted. The things you have been putting off, because there would always be a better time, reveal themselves not as postponed, but as unchosen. The relationships you have been taking for granted reveal themselves as finite gifts, whose finitude was always the truth, just not the part of the truth you were holding in the front of your mind. The ordinary day reveals itself as the actual content of the actual life, not a prelude to some later version of the life where the real living would begin. This is what Stoic philosophy, which the game does not explicitly invoke but whose presence can be felt in various moments across the late chapters, calls memento mori, the active, ongoing remembering of death, not as a morbid preoccupation, but as a clarifying lens that makes the present more vivid and the choices available within it more distinct. If you carry the awareness of mortality genuinely, not with panic but with the specific honesty that awareness requires, it becomes possible to stop spending time on things that, in the genuine context of a finite life, you do not actually care about that much, and to spend more of it on the things that genuinely matter to you, not in theory, not as a matter of stated values that do not connect to actual behavior, but in practice. Arthur does this imperfectly and gradually, and with the particular texture of a man who has not had much practice at this kind of self-direction in the game's final chapters. He spends time with people he loves. He talks honestly in ways he did not previously make space for. He makes choices that align with who he wants to be, rather than only with what the situation mechanically requires. He rides to the top of a hill to watch a sunrise for no reason except that watching a sunrise is, in the honest accounting of what is available to do with a given hour, one of the better uses of it. The high honor ending, Arthur crawling to the summit of a mountain as the sun is rising over the full spread of the world the game has spent 100 hours building, is one of the most beautiful sequences in any game ever made. It is beautiful not because it is spectacular, though it is visually extraordinary, but because it has been earned by everything that preceded it, by every sketch in the journal, by every conversation at the campfire, by every stranger encounter and small act of decency, by every honest moment of self-examination. The world the game built around this man is fully real to the person who has spent the time in it, and watching him die in it is a genuine form of grief that is inseparable from genuine love for what is being lost. The stag stands in the tree line. It does not do anything dramatic. It does not speak or perform any particular action. It simply stands there, present, as Arthur is present, in the light of a morning that neither of them will see through to the evening. And in that stillness, there is something that does not require elaborate language to recognize. The sense of a life that, for all its violence and failure and the enormous distance between the person it started as and the person it became, was reaching towards something real in its final portion. The lesson for the living in all of this is not that you need a terminal diagnosis to access the clarity that Arthur finds. The game is too careful and too honest to make that specific argument. What it suggests instead, through everything from the journal to the quality of the landscape to the honor system, is that the awareness of impermanence, which is real and always available and does not require catastrophic news to be honest about, is one of the more useful lenses through which to examine how you are spending the time you have, not with panic, not with the specific variety of anxiety that the proximity of death can generate when it is approached without preparation, with the honest, clear-eyed acknowledgement that the present moment is all there is, and that the present moment is, in fact, enough. The campfire at night in the early game, with the music and the conversations and the warm light against the faces of people who matter to each other, is a perfect present moment. It does not need anything added to it. It is complete in itself. And the person who is fully there for it, who is not thinking about the next thing or managing the anxiety about the last thing, who is simply in the warmth and the light and the sound of people they love being alive and present, has something that the person who is technically present but not actually there cannot reach. The game teaches this by building something you grieve leaving, by making you fully present in the world it constructs, before it shows you what the loss of that world costs. By demonstrating, through the specific architecture of its most affecting sequences, that the depth of grief is exactly proportional to the depth of the love that preceded it, and that the depth of love is exactly proportional to the degree of genuine presence that was actually there. Chapter 9. The Legacy You Leave in the Dust. The game does not end when Arthur dies. This matters. Not because the story continuing after his death diminishes the loss, it does not, but because what follows his death is the argument the game has been building toward across its entire length. The epilogue, which takes up a significant portion of the game's final section, follows John Marston through the years after Arthur's sacrifice, from the immediate aftermath, when John and Abigail and Jack are in hiding and trying to establish a new life, through the months of working to acquire land and build something permanent on it. Arthur's legacy, in the most concrete form the game provides, is this: John and Abigail and Jack, alive and together with land they own, and a future that is actually possible because of the specific choices Arthur made in the final months of his life. Arthur spent those months ensuring John survived, getting him away from the Pinkerton net, working to secure enough money for the family to have options, dying on that mountain in part so that John did not have to. He did all of this without knowing for certain that it would work, without receiving confirmation that the sacrifice was sufficient. He made the best decisions he could with what he understood, and then the world carried on without him. This is the specific texture of genuine sacrifice, which differs from heroic gesture in exactly this way. The heroic gesture often comes with confirmation. The audience sees the result. The person making the gesture knows, in some form, that it worked. The sacrifice often does not. You make the best choice you can with the information available about what matters and what will serve the people you love, and then you are gone, and the world goes on without you, and you do not get to find out how it turned out. John builds a house on the land in Beecher's Hope. He builds it himself, with his own imperfect hands, learning as he goes. The house that goes up on that land is clearly the work of a man who has no particular background in construction. The boards are not all precisely level. The nails are not all at optimal angles. There is a homemade quality to all of it that a professional would notice. But it stands. It is a real structure in a real place that John Marston built with his hands over the course of months because he needed it to exist and no one else was going to build it for him. Arthur Morgan does not get to see it. He does not get to watch Jack grow up. He does not get to know whether the winter that followed his death was survivable for the family he left behind. He does not get to receive the confirmation that would make the sacrifice feel complete. What he had in the final months before he died was the knowledge that he was trying to do the right thing, that the choices he was making were the best available alignment between what mattered to him and what he could actually do within his circumstances. That was enough to die with. Legacy, in the game's treatment of it, is not monument. It is not having a building named after you or a historical role you will be remembered for, or a reputation that outlasts your specific presence. It is the particular impact, often invisible to the person generating it, of having shown up for the people who needed you, of having done the specific things in your hands to do, for the people you loved, at the cost of what those things cost. Arthur gave John the time and space to build the life in Beecher's Hope. John gave Jack the father who came back. Arthur gave every stranger he stopped for a moment, of being seen and helped by someone under no obligation to stop. The journal John inherits from Arthur, the 500 pages of sketches and observations and honest reflection that Arthur built across the game's whole story, shifts noticeably in tone when John begins writing in it after Arthur's death. John writes more briefly, more practically. The entries are oriented toward the immediate and the logistical in ways Arthur's were not. The difference says something true about the particular nature of each man. And it also marks, in the simplest possible way, the absence of the person who wrote the earlier entries. The journal continues. The life it was attached to does not. The grief of that specific gap is the grief of someone who actually existed. There is a version of the legacy question that becomes oppressive when it is framed as a measure of whether your life justified itself, whether you accomplished enough, whether you were significant enough, whether the world will notice or remember. That framing puts the meaning of a life at the mercy of external evaluation, which is both a high-stakes dependency and a somewhat misguided one. The game frames it differently, through the accumulated small acts of the honor system, and through the specific shape of Arthur's last months. It suggests something quieter and more available. Legacy is the texture of how you treated the people and the world you moved through, accumulated across the whole of your time here. It is present in the specific memories of the people who knew you, and in the quiet effects of choices that rippled outward in ways you could not fully trace. John's house in Beecher's Hope is Arthur Morgan's legacy. Imperfect, built by someone who was learning the whole time, located in a world that will eventually reach even this corner of the frontier. But real, genuinely, solidly real. Something that would not exist without everything Arthur chose to do, and to be in the final months of a life that cost him everything it cost him. The game's epilogue lands with a particular emotional combination, melancholy and affirmation existing simultaneously in the same frame. Melancholy because Arthur is not there, because the costs were real and the paying of them was real, and the world in which John builds his house and lives his life is a world from which Arthur is simply absent. And affirming because the house is standing, because Jack is alive, because Abigail and John are together on the land, because the choice to spend whatever you have on something that will outlast you, rather than on the consumption of what is immediately available, is not a fantasy. People actually do this, and the world is actually shaped in specific and local and human ways by the doing of it. This is the last lesson and the quietest one. The time you have is finite. The particular configuration of your life right now, the people in it, the specific world you are moving through, will change. What you do in the time between right now and the end of this configuration matters not in any cosmic or scored sense, but in the specific, local, human sense of having been the person in other people's lives who showed up when it counted, who left something real when they went, who loved the world they were given with the full attention the pace of living allowed, who tried. Arthur Morgan was not a good man by most conventional measures. He was a man who tried. He tried harder and more honestly in the last portion of his life than in any before it. And what he built with that trying, at the cost of everything, was a small piece of a better world for the people he loved. The house in Beecher's Hope, a family together on land they own. A boy who grows up with something like a father, that is not nothing. That is, in the honest accounting of what a life can actually do, quite a lot. Closing the sunrise is still there. So here we are, somewhere well past the beginning of this, into the territory of late night where the thoughts are slower, and the breath is deeper, and the day has finally, mostly, let go. If you made it this far through, you spent time with something that rewarded the spending. And if any of this slipped into the half-awareness of sleep already beginning at the edges, that is exactly right. That is what this kind of slow movement through something real is for. Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of those rare things that rewards patience in a world that rarely does. It slows you down. It asks you to be present in a way that modern life spends enormous energy training you not to be. It builds something so richly real that leaving it costs something genuine, and it teaches you through that cost that everything worth loving is worth grieving and everything worth grieving was worth the full weight of the love. Arthur Morgan rode toward his final sunrise on a mountain with everything he had left, and watched it with the full attention that dying had finally taught him to bring to the living. The stag stood in the tree line. The light came over the mountains. Whatever words or categories or frameworks you use for the emotions you felt watching that, if you have watched it, they were about something true. They were about a life that, for all its failures and wrong directions and accumulated violence, had something in it that kept reaching toward what was actually good, even at the end, especially at the end. Slow down when you can. Not always, not in ways that abandon what needs doing, but in the available spaces. Let the ride through the heartlands be slow. Let the campfire take as long as it takes. Write in the journal even when nothing dramatic is happening. Pay attention to the heron. Be honest with yourself in the dark. Ride with the people who tell you the truth. Let go of what has stopped working and hold closer what still does. Show up for the strangers. Do the small things. They build, across time, into something larger and more durable than any single large act. And if you are carrying something heavy tonight, set it down for a few hours. It will be exactly where you left it in the morning. Right now, the only job is rest. If this kind of video is the kind you come back to, leave a like before sleep takes you fully. It costs nothing, and it does more for getting this content to the right people than you might expect. Subscribe if you have not. There is more of this coming. More worlds built by people who cared about the details. More slow rides through things that are beautiful and complicated, and worth sitting with carefully. You should be here for them. The heartlands are still out there. The fire is still burning. The harmonica is still playing something that sounds like rest. Sleep well. End of script. Bonus chapter. The horse, the journal, and the things nobody sees you do. There is a moment available in Red Dead Redemption 2 that no one will ever make a video essay about specifically because it is so small and so quiet and so entirely disconnected from anything the game requires you to do. You are riding somewhere in the Grizzlies, the northern mountain range, and the weather has shifted while you were not paying particular attention to it. The temperature has dropped. There is a specific kind of cold that the higher elevations produce in this game that you can feel in the quality of the light and the sound and the way the wind moves differently through pine trees than it does through the grassland you were in an hour ago. Your horse's breath is visible. The ground is frozen in patches. You stop for no mechanical reason. You just stop. You look at the mountains, and the mountains are extraordinary. This moment, the stopped moment with the mountains, is not in any walkthrough. It does not have a specific time or location. It is available at any point in the game to anyone willing to stop riding toward the next objective long enough to notice what is around them. And it is, in its quiet way, the entire argument the game is making about how to be in a world. The horse is a significant part of this argument. Your relationship with your horse in Red Dead Redemption 2 is not a mechanic in the conventional sense. It is a relationship. You build it over time, through the specific practices of care and attention that the game requires if you want the relationship to be good. You brush the horse. You feed it. You talk to it, the gruff, affectionate way Arthur addresses his horse, which reveals something about him that nothing in the main narrative states directly. You pat its flank after a difficult ride. And the horse responds to all of this with a responsiveness that is, within the game's systems, genuinely affecting. A horse that trusts you completely moves differently than one that is merely being used. It responds to subtle commands. It runs without panic through situations that would spook an animal with less confidence in its rider. The relationship produces something real. This is not an accident of design. The horse relationship is a deliberate argument that care, invested consistently over time into the small, unremarkable acts of tending to another living thing, produces a quality of connection that cannot be generated any other way. You cannot speed-run your way to a deeply bonded horse. You cannot skip the brushing and the feeding and the talking and arrive at the trust. The trust is built from those specific, repetitive acts of attention, which is exactly how trust works between any two living things, animal or human, over any period of time. The journal, again, deserves more time than any single mention can give it. Because the journal is the game's clearest portrait of what it looks like when a person develops the habit of honest self-observation over time. Arthur's early journal entries in the game's first chapters have a different quality than the later ones. Earlier, Arthur is more guarded, more transactional. He writes about what happened rather than what he felt about what happened, notes facts rather than processing their significance. The journal of a person who has not quite developed the trust in the practice to give it full access yet. As the game progresses and the diagnosis lands and the time remaining contracts, the entries change. They become more candid, more willing to sit with the uncomfortable thing rather than documenting the event and moving on. The Arthur who writes about the Downs widow and what seeing her meant to him is writing differently than the Arthur who wrote about the first robbery of the game. He has learned, through the process of keeping the journal, that the writing itself is a form of processing. That putting the thing on the page, even imperfectly and without resolution, is different from carrying it internally where it can only circle. This is something that people who keep journals regularly tend to discover, and that people who have never tried tend to be skeptical of. The act of writing is not just documentation. It is the act of finding out what you actually think, as opposed to what you think you think. The page provides the externality that pure interior thought cannot. When you write a sentence, you can read it back. You can see whether it is true. You can see whether the thought it expresses is actually what you mean, or whether the act of putting it in words has revealed that the thought was more complex or more honest, or more afraid than its surface presentation suggested. Arthur's journal is full of moments like this. He writes something down, reads it back in the writing of the next sentence, and the next sentence is slightly truer because of what the previous one revealed. He is figuring himself out in real time on the page, which is what the page is for when you are honest with it. The stranger missions, the 31 strands, and the dozens of random encounters that populate the game's world independent of the main narrative are worth spending one more long moment with. Because the aggregate of them, the pattern they form when you encounter them across 100 hours of play, constitutes something like a portrait of what a full world of human need actually looks like. Every variety of difficulty is represented. People are lost, sick, grieving, in debt, estranged from family members, building things that keep collapsing, pursuing passions that the people around them do not understand, trying to survive circumstances they did not choose. The world is full of this, not as a parade of misery, but as the normal texture of human life. The fact that every person you encounter is carrying something, and navigating something, and hoping for something, simultaneously. Arthur's habit of stopping and engaging with these situations, when he chooses to, is a habit of taking other people's humanity seriously, of declining the easier posture that would keep moving past everything that is not directly relevant to the immediate objective. This posture, the posture of genuine engagement with the specific reality of the specific person in front of you, is not something most environments actively reward. The efficiency-oriented world, which is the world most of us inhabit most of the time, rewards getting through interactions rather than being genuinely in them. The clerk at the store, the person on the other end of the phone call, the stranger whose bag you could help pick up, or whose question you could actually answer instead of gesturing vaguely in a direction, they are not abstractions. They are people carrying specific things and navigating specific situations and having a specific kind of day that your presence is now a part of. The game makes you stop for this. Not always. You can move through the world of RDR2 without stopping for strangers, and you will complete the game. But the game makes the stopping available, and it quietly rewards it, and it builds an argument through the accumulation of those encounters that the stopping is not inefficiency. It is the actual content of a life that is being fully lived. There is a specific kind of person that Arthur Morgan becomes, across the full arc of the game, that is worth naming directly. He becomes a person who has made peace with his own complexity, who no longer needs to resolve the contradiction between the violence in his history and the kindness in his character by insisting that one of them is more true than the other. Both are true. He was what he was for a long time, and some of what he was did real harm. He is also what he is becoming in the final chapters, and some of what he is becoming is genuinely good. The contradiction is not resolved. It is accepted. And in that acceptance, there is a quality of wholeness that is more honest than any simpler story would produce. This is one of the things Red Dead Redemption 2 does better than almost anything else in any medium. It builds a character who is fully complicated in the way actual people are fully complicated, and then it refuses to simplify him for the audience's comfort. Arthur is not redeemable in any clean way. He is also not simply damned. He is a person doing his best with what he has, late in a difficult life, under conditions that did not particularly prepare him for the quality of self-examination he is attempting. And that is enough. The trying is enough, not because it changes everything, but because, as Rain's Fall suggests, it is considerably more than nothing, and it is, in fact, the most any of us can actually do. The world of 1,899 inches this game is ending. It ends before the credits roll. The gang is gone. Dutch is broken. Micah is dead. The outlaw era has given way to the era that the first Red Dead Redemption depicts, the era in which the last outlaws are being hunted down one by the same forces that hunted the Vanderlinde gang. The world that built all of these characters and gave them their particular forms is becoming historical before the characters have finished living in it. And yet, the mountains are still there. The rivers are still moving through the valleys with that specific sound of water over stone. The mornings still come with their sequence of light, the darkness, and then the gray, and then the purple, and then the orange, and then the full gold of a day that is, in the honest accounting of what is available on any given day, more beautiful than anyone who did not stop to look at it would ever know. The game keeps telling you to look. Every sunrise, every sunset, every moment of weather changing over an open landscape, every heron standing at the edge of a creek. Look at it. You are here. The world is here. The people who matter to you are, in whatever specific form your actual life has given them, present and finite and real. The time is now, not later, not when things calm down. Now, in the specific now that is actually here, which is the only now that ever was, Arthur Morgan got there at the end. Standing at the top of a mountain, dying, watching the light come up over a world he had been moving through for 40 years, and had only recently, in the fullness of the time he had left, actually started to see. The stag is there, the light is there. The world is still doing what the world does, magnificent and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful, when you are genuinely present for them. You are here. The light is coming. Sleep now. If this reached you tonight, if something in here landed where it was supposed to land, leave a comment before you go. Tell me the time and where you are. Tell me what part of this stayed with you, or what part of the game you love the most. Drop a like if you got to the end. Subscribe if you want more of this, and share it with the person in your life who you think needs a long, slow ride through something beautiful and true tonight. There is more of this coming. More worlds worth living in, slowly. More stories that teach something real through the care they took in the telling. You should be there for them. Sleep well. You earned it. End of full script. Extended reflection. The sound of a world worth inhabiting. One of the specific things Red Dead Redemption 2 does that almost no other game does at the same level is its sound design. Not the music, which is extraordinary on its own terms, but the ambient sound. The way rain sounds on different surfaces, on canvas tent material versus dry grass versus the wood roof of a covered porch. The way wind works differently through pine forests than through bare rock faces in the high mountains. The specific quality of nighttime in different biomes, how the sounds of insects and frogs in the swamps of Lemoyne are completely unlike the silence of the grizzlies at midnight, with only the wind and the settling of snow to break it. The way a fire sounds when it is well established and comfortable versus the tentative crackling of something just starting to catch. These sounds are not incidental. They are the game's way of constructing a world that has genuine texture, that rewards the person who allows themselves to actually inhabit it, rather than simply navigate it. They are the equivalent of the detail in Arthur's journal that did not need to be there. Nobody required Rockstar to render the sound of rain differently on different surfaces, but they did, because the kind of world they were building deserved that level of care. Because the people who would spend time inside that world deserved to be given something genuinely real to inhabit. Sound is one of the most direct routes to the sense of presence. When the sounds around you are accurate, when they match the visual information with the fidelity that actual environments produce, something in your nervous system relaxes into the belief that you are somewhere real. The world stops being a representation you are observing and starts being a place you are inside. This is why the game works so powerfully as a relaxing environment, even when nothing particular is happening in it, why so many people have spent hours simply riding slowly through it, not doing missions, not hunting or collecting or completing objectives, just riding. The world is so fully constructed that being in it is its own form of rest. Dutch van der Linde is an excellent reader of books. This is not a throwaway detail. It is one of the specific qualities that the game establishes about him early, through his dialogues and through the camp's library, which contains the kinds of books a self-educated man with particular intellectual interests would have accumulated across decades of travel. He has read widely in philosophy and political theory and literature. He quotes from them, sometimes accurately, sometimes with the particular modifications that a man who has absorbed ideas and used them for his own purposes applies. He knows the Enlightenment thinkers. He has a working relationship with the language of freedom and natural rights and social contract theory. This matters for understanding how a man can be both as intelligent as Dutch clearly is and as blind to certain things as he equally clearly is. Intelligence does not protect against the specific form of self-deception that Dutch practices. It may even facilitate it by providing the vocabulary to make the self-deception sound more sophisticated. A man who has read Rousseau and Thoreau and can quote them fluently is equally capable of using that framework to justify behavior that Rousseau and Thoreau would have found troubling, because the framework is being applied not as a genuine intellectual discipline, but as a validation mechanism for choices already made on other grounds. This is worth thinking about because it describes a pattern that is common and recognizable in the world outside fiction. Intelligent people are not less susceptible to the particular form of motivated reasoning, where you find the intellectual framework that supports the conclusion you were already going to reach. They are sometimes more susceptible because the quality of their intellectual toolkit makes the rationalizations more convincing to themselves and to others. Dutch can always find a reason why this particular act of violence was actually an expression of his values rather than a violation of them, and the reason he finds is always eloquent and always insufficient. Arthur does not have Dutch's intellectual vocabulary. His reflections in the journal are plain-spoken rather than philosophically elaborate, but they are honest in a way that Dutch's never fully are, because they are not in service of any larger self-image that needs protecting. Arthur does not need to be the visionary. He can be the person who made mistakes and is trying to do something different. The simplicity of his self-description is not a limitation. It is a form of freedom that Dutch's more elaborate self-construction forecloses. John Marston's relationship with education is one of the small threads of the epilogue that rewards attention. Dutch and Hosea taught John to read and write when they took him in as a teenager, the same thing they did for Arthur. The epilogue shows John reading, slowly and with visible effort, working through books as part of the process of building a different kind of life. He is not a natural reader. The effort is apparent, but he persists at it because it is part of the life he is trying to build, the life where his son grows up with a father who is present and capable and trying. Jack is shown reading throughout the epilogue, easily and with obvious pleasure. He loves books the way children love books when they have been given reason to. The education passed through generations, from Dutch and Hosea to John and Arthur, and then from John to Jack, is one of the quiet legacies the game traces. Red Dead Redemption 2, released on October 26, 2018, and in the years since, it has not diminished in the estimation of the people who played it. If anything, it has grown. The discussions are still active. The analysis is still ongoing. People still return to it, years later, not because they want to see how the plot resolves, but because the world it built is a world worth living in for a while, and the story it tells is one that bears sitting with again in different moments of a life. The things it is saying about mortality and loyalty and the end of eras and the nature of character have a quality that does not expire with the first encounter. They stay available for the next time you need them, which tends to be more often than the first encounter would suggest. The mountains are not going anywhere. The heartlands are not going anywhere. Arthur's journal, those 500 pages of honest attention to a world he was moving through as carefully as he could manage, is not going anywhere. The campfire where Hosea told stories, and Pearson cooked badly, and Charles sat in comfortable silence, is still there, exactly as it was, available to anyone who wants to sit beside it for a while and feel what it feels like to be somewhere that is trying, imperfectly and genuinely, to be a home. Rest now. The world will still be there in the morning, and so will you, with which is the thing that matters most of all. Final end of script, total script, complete. Final note, why this game keeps calling you back. There is a reason you came back to this game, or came to this video about this game, at whatever hour you found it. There is a reason that among all the things available to watch or listen to or play or simply stare at in the late hours, something in you moved toward the world of 1899 and the campfire and the wide quiet of the American West, as it was in the last months of its particular kind of existence. The reason, reduced to its most essential form, is this. Red Dead Redemption 2 takes you seriously. It treats the time you give it as worth giving something real in return. It does not assume that the experience of being a person is primarily about urgency and stimulation and the constant forward motion of content. It assumes instead that there are parts of a person that need quiet, need space, need the kind of world that rewards being present inside it rather than consuming it as fast as possible. It builds that world and it gives it to you and it lets you stay in it for as long as you need. Arthur Morgan takes you seriously too, in the specific way that a well-written character takes you seriously. He is not a fantasy figure. He is not a power trip. He is a complicated, honestly rendered human being working through the specific difficulty of being alive, with limited time and limited information, and a history that does not make anything easier, trying to end up on the right side of the only question that the end of things actually asks. Did you try? Did you love what deserved your love? Did you see what was in front of you clearly enough to respond to it honestly? He did, in the end. He tried. The game says this is enough, and it means it. The mountains are still catching the light of whatever hour it is right now. The river is still moving through the valley with that specific sound. The camp is still there, the fire low but present, throwing just enough light to see the faces of the people who have been through this together, who are still here, who will be here tomorrow in whatever configuration tomorrow brings. And somewhere in the trees at the edge of a clearing, in the particular stillness of the early morning or the late evening, a stag is standing, looking, present in the way that things in the wild are present, completely, without reservation, without the specific human weight of all the things that are not happening right now. You are allowed to rest. The world will still be there. The story will still be there. You will still be there. And tomorrow, if it is a day that gives you any of it, the sunrise will come over the mountains the way it always comes, the darkness breaking into the first colors of a day that has not happened yet and contains everything that is still possible. That is enough. It was always enough. Good night. The comment section is open. Whatever brought you here tonight, leave a trace of it. The time, the place, the thing from the game that means the most to you. Those comments are the campfire this channel builds, one person at a time, one night at a time. You belong here. You always did. Subscribe if you have not, like if the video moved you, and share it with whoever needs a slow ride through something true tonight. The algorithm can find people. Help it find the right ones. Until the next one, ride safe, sleep well. The heartlands are waiting.